And I rise to register my distress and disgust at this bill and my disappointment in the government which seeks to pass it. Deputy Speaker, the release of greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide and methane from human activities such as the burning of fossil fuels contributes to climate change. In signing the Paris Agreement, Australia committed to reducing its greenhouse gas emissions. Our purpose in doing so was to contribute as a nation to global efforts to limit the progressive, scientifically documented increase in average temperature of our planet as it approaches 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Doing so demands urgent action to limit the release of greenhouse gases. While it is also appropriate to look at the rapid and extensive deployment of mitigation options to offset the activities of those industries where some release of greenhouse gases is at this point inevitable, the first and the primary focus of our efforts must be to decrease the extent to which we pollute our planet, not concentration on unproven and effortful attempts to claw back the harm that we have inflicted on our lands, our atmosphere and our seas. The latest synthesis report of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change confirmed the urgent need for ambitious action to limit global warming. It confirmed yet again that this planet has no room for new fossil fuel projects, that significant and immediate cuts to emissions are required this decade if we are to have any chance of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Just this week, the UN chief has told us that the era of global boiling has arrived, that climate change is here. It's terrifying and it's just the beginning. Climate change is already having profound impacts across the globe. Every increment of warming will increase those hazards. Globally, those most affected will almost invariably be those who are least responsible. The hazards to human health include the physical effects of raised temperatures, the emotional trauma caused by extreme weather events, and the cumulative effects of loss of livelihoods, environments and cultures. The oceans play a central role in regulating the Earth's climate. They act as major heat and carbon sinks. Climate change's impact on the oceans includes temperature rise, ocean acidification, sea level rise and the expansion of oxygen minimum zones. These have downstream impacts on ecosystem services such as the provision of livelihoods and foods. This Environment Protection Dumping Amendment, using technologies to fight climate change, proposes to amend the existing Sea Dumping Act to implement the 2009 and 2013 amendments to the London Protocol. In short, it seeks to allow the issue of permits for the export of carbon dioxide streams for the purpose of sequestration into subseabed geological formations. In other words, this bill permits carbon capture and storage under ocean seabeds. It also allows for marine geoengineering activities for the purpose, theoretically, of scientific research. But the impact and effectiveness of that geoengineering research are largely unclear, and their environmental risks are unknown. Put simply, this bill is a key enabler of the gas industry's plans to significantly expand Australia's engagement with carbon capture and storage in Australia and its import and export of CO2 across international borders. CCS and the global trade of CO2 streams are crucial to the gas industry's global strategy to gain social licence by appearing to act on climate, while simultaneously opening up new fossil fuel projects against the explicit advice of bodies such as the International Energy Agency and the IPCC. This bill aims to facilitate the greenwashing of fossil fuel expansion plans in Australia. Let's review what subseabed geological sequestration of carbon dioxide streams would involve. Carbon capture and storage involves capturing, transporting and storing carbon dioxide from the burning of fossil fuels and other industrial processes. That CO2 is then transported via a ship and/or a pipeline. There are, of course, further emissions arising from that transport process to a storage location. It is then injected into and stored within a subseabed geological formation isolated from the atmosphere. The consequences of this process then have to be verified, monitored and mitigated. The IPCC observed in its 2005 special report on carbon capture and storage that the widespread application of this technology would depend on technological maturity, costs, overall potential, transfer of technology to developing countries, and their capacity to apply that technology, regulation, environmental issues and the public perceptions. Almost 20 years later, carbon capture and storage remains an unproven technology which has never achieved target at scale. Only one CCS project is currently active in Australia. Chevron's Gorgon carbon capture and storage project on Barrow Island in Western Australia has consistently failed to effectively sequester the required reservoir CO2 generated by the Gorgon LNG project. Gorgon is the largest operating carbon capture and storage project in the world. So far, it's cost more than $3 billion, $60 million of which has come from federal government funding. It's currently sequestering about a third of its capacity 5 years after initiation. It is the biggest and best exemplar worldwide of an ineffective technology. But we've seen similar failures in Norwegian CCS projects as well. There are currently 30 operational CCS projects worldwide. None has demonstrated effect and safety at the scale required for carbon capture and storage to be used at the scale required for this bill. The Australia Institute has estimated that the combined climate mitigation of all projects underway globally would cumulatively amount to approximately 6.2 million tonnes of greenhouse gases a year. That's roughly the equivalent of the emissions of one Port Kembla steelworks, perhaps 0.2% of global fossil fuel emissions each year. Even were it 100% effective, which is far from the case, CCS continues to ignore the 85 to 90% of total emissions from the energy sector, which represent Scope 3 emissions from oil and gas burned by consumers. At this time, carbon capture and storage have no place in credible pathways to net zero. Why are we talking now about exporting our carbon dioxide streams? We're doing it to pander to Santos and its plans to establish a carbon capture and storage project in its existing Bayu Undan gas field. Santos plans to channel carbon from the offshore Barossa project via the Middle Arm precinct in Darwin Harbour. Other future stores of CO2 for that field include the Beetaloo and Bonaparte basins, the Middle Arm petrochemicals facility, the Virus gas field and international countries which currently lack CCS facilities, including Japan, Singapore and Korea. The unseemly haste with which this bill has been brought to this House appears to reflect the government's desire to assuage the anxiety of Santos and other investors that the Barossa project and other fossil fuel projects off our northern coastline can proceed post-haste, heedless of the potential handbrake effect of the safeguard mechanism. This is despite the absence of approvals or environmental impact statements for either Bayu Undan or for Middle Arm. All of this without consideration of the direct and indirect environmental and health risks involved. Indirectly, the false proposition of CCS can be used as justification for locking in existing energy structures, i.e. the continued and increasing extraction of fossil fuels. Directly, there are risks associated with transporting carbon dioxide and with potential leaks from undersea or underground stores. Environmental risks of carbon capture and transport include the unintentional release of carbon dioxide streams into the environment during transport in ships and pipelines and from storage facilities. High carbon dioxide concentrations in the air harm people and they harm animals. They cause asphyxiation. This is a risk offshore, but also in onshore hubs like the Middle Arm, which is adjacent to population centres in Darwin. In a sub-seabed setting, dissolved carbon dioxide acidifies water. It affects aquatic organisms and can cause their asphyxiation. Aquatic ecosystems are also threatened by the physical disturbance of drilling and of laying pipelines and by seismic events, subsidence and displacement of aquifers during carbon dioxide injection. Ocean acidity will affect our food systems by adversely affecting marine life. The geomechanical risks associated with carbon capture and storage include abnormal seismic activity, surface uplift and carbon dioxide leakage. Large-scale shipping of carbon dioxide is a new technology which includes multiple technical and operational challenges. Each of these requires appropriate safety protocols and uses unquantified amounts of energy. Moisture-laden carbon dioxide, such as that transported in carbon capture and storage, is highly corrosive. The loss of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere from ships during transport is between 3 and 4% per 1,000 kilometres, which means that a loss of 20% of the carbon dioxide load should be expected from export activities between countries such as Japan, Korea, Australia and Timor-Leste. It is simplistic to think that a long 20-year-old pipeline designed for the transfer of natural gas can be easily retrofitted to a reverse transfer of highly pressurised corrosive carbon dioxide. The various safety and regulatory frameworks involved are not present in this bill. The bill fails to stipulate compliance requirements necessary for the minister to grant a carbon dioxide expert permit. It requires no environmental impact assessments to be undertaken for carbon dioxide import or export or for marine geoengineering. It includes no regulations around the circumstances of carbon dioxide transport. It sets no expectations regarding the regulatory capacity and readiness of destination countries to create and maintain adequate environmental protections. I also note that both offshore gas projects and carbon capture storage have implications for the cultural practices of traditional owners on sea country. These implications are also not addressed in this bill. The bill is not situated within a robust regulatory framework which engages and is consistent with the Safeguard Mechanism, the Offshore Petroleum and Greenhouse Gas Storage Act, the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act and other emission reduction legislation. It does not specify which government department will have regulatory responsibility for subsea bed sequestration if that occurs in Australian waters. It does not clarify who will be responsible and who will have transboundary liability in the event of accidents. It does not stipulate how export of carbon dioxide will impact our Paris Agreement target compliance and our emissions inventory reporting. In seeking to help fossil fuel companies circumvent the Safeguard Mechanism and to avoid responsibility for their greenhouse gas emissions, this bill is inconsistent with the global effort to achieve the Paris Agreement. Deputy Speaker, carbon capture and storage is an unproven, costly technology. Promoting it and supporting it via legislation undermines our efforts to decarbonise by giving false credit to a false science, by diverting funding from proven technologies that could reduce emissions and by delaying our transmission to renewables. This bill will be a key enabler of gas expansion. It will grant social licence for new, highly polluting, greenwashed fossil fuel projects. We must protect our oceans and our aquatic ecosystems from the threats of concentrated liquefied carbon dioxide. Passage of this bill will kick a toxic carbonated can down the road to our international neighbours. In passing this bill, we would be signalling to the rest of the world our refusal to take responsibility for our own emissions and our willingness to dump them on our neighbours, without due consideration of the physical or moral safety of that transfer. I cannot, in any conscience, commend this bill to the House.